That was really interesting and very pertinent to the Conul strategy, as you highlighted there. I'm going to introduce now Katherine MacSharry, who's going to talk to us about 2 community collection initiatives that the National Library undertook as part of the Decade of Commemoration. Katherine is, as most of you will be well aware, is Head of Outreach at the National Library with a portfolio that includes exhibitions and public programs, learning activities, public affairs, marketing and communications. Katherine, thank you.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Michelle. Michelle and I worked together a number of years ago in a very collaborative way, so it's nice to be sharing the platform here today as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'm at MacSharry on Twitter if you want to at me into any of your conversations. If you're going to say anything unpleasant, feel free to subtweet. What I want to talk to you about is the community collecting that the National Library has been involved in and what we learned from it. I think it fits particularly well with the conference theme of going further together. So both in terms of our communities and our users and other actors in the cultural heritage and information space. Now I'm very nervous about this. Yeah. So I guess it's no surprise to anyone that the National Library of Ireland is really beautiful, in a wonderful location in the heart of Dublin. And it's also, in the main, a very welcoming place, whether for those carrying out research in the beautiful reading room that you can see here under the blue and aquamarine dome, for those visiting our exhibitions and events, and for those enjoying a great coffee and a nice slice of cake. A nice slice of cake is a great thing to have for your visitors. It's not actually a brilliant thing to have in close adjacency to your own working environment, is my experience. And that tradition of welcome and engagement goes back a very long time, to when the National Library was founded in 1877 and the building was opened in 1890. At the time, Dublin had very few public libraries, so the National Library was a central place for knowledge sharing, for debate, for people to come together in a social space. There's even a quote from Yeats where he says he was sitting in the reading room of the National Library and one of the librarians, he says, comes and argues with me. Now, they were arguing about a particular literary topic. It wasn't that one of the librarians was coming to harangue him, but it gives you this sense of the National Library as a conversation. So it was very much about that interactivity rather than just pushing out information in one way to passive recipients. We can also see the centrality and importance of the National Library in this docket here. So this is taken from the MacDonagh collection. This is a docket to request books from the National Library's collections, which has notes scribbled on it in Thomas MacDonagh, one of the signatory of the proclamations, absolutely terrible handwriting. All the other 6, fantastic. MacDonagh, incredibly difficult to read. And what that tells us, I suppose, is that dockets have been used for scribbling for a very long time, and that MacDonagh, like so many other young people, was a regular at the National Library. And so we have this welcoming, friendly, engaged tradition, and for many millions, walking under that archway with the library word emblazoned above it has been a passport to a whole world. And yet, for large numbers of people, the idea evoked by the words National Library and the magnificent buildings is not welcome and comfort and enjoyment, but something a bit more like this. And it's interesting, I think, that we've already heard this discussion this morning, this notion of library anxiety, of the fear evoked for people often by the very same things that are welcoming and comforting for others. In case you were any doubt as to what the faces mean, the authoritative source of Emojipedia provided the information. Itself, of course, a collaborative resource. And these are the faces who are the counterpart to those people who have enjoyed and loved the National Library. The people who are not sure whether there's anything there for them. The people who don't feel part of the conversation that happens there or online. The people who visited once 30 years ago and the architecture or whoever they encountered made them feel unwanted and they never came back. And these faces are one of the reasons that we were interested in community collecting, as one of a number of ways to connect in a relationship of equals with people who hold important pieces in the jigsaw of our national story through family memorabilia treasured for generations, but who themselves might never have been through the door of the National Library. It's a way for us to collaborate with new and with long-standing communities. We were also conscious that the Decade of Commemorations, with its renewed focus on social as well as political history, was a great opportunity to engage in this activity. And we're also equally aware that by the nature of the collections that often come to national libraries and other collecting institutions, there are gaps in terms of the social, and it's hard to find a word for this that doesn't sound pejorative, but absolutely isn't, the everyday story that is held by so many people through the country. And that those gaps could partly be addressed by this type of process. And so, when we were approached in 2012 by Europeana, that's Europe's digital library, archive and museum, to be a partner in a pan-European project collecting the memory of World War I, we were delighted to get involved. And basically what these events involve is an invitation to someone who has material, letters, diaries, pictures, postcards, connected with a particular event, in this instance, World War I, to come to a particular place, have the material digitized, tell their story, have the story recorded in their own words, and be enabled to take their material home with them, so that the national story can be enhanced, the material can go online, the story can go online, but the person doesn't give up the treasures that they have. And I think it's very important to us that the stories we recorded were in the voices of the person who told us. Because one of the things, of course, that will happen when people talk to you about their family history and their family memorabilia, they are not historians. This is not a factual record necessarily of what happened, and the family story around what happened also has significance. It's interesting as well, I think, because while World War I was a very particularly interesting topic for Ireland because there were a lot of people who had a lot of material, it touched so many families, and who had never had an opportunity, they felt, to talk about that experience, it's a process that works regardless of the topic, and one to think about in terms of your own communities, academic, outreach into your local community. Are there things that they are interested in where a process like this might work? One of the fantastic but very sharply learned lessons that we had was that the public appetite for the process was enormous. On that first day in 2012, we had huge numbers. And if you're wondering what a woman who is slightly overwhelmed by unfolding events and is thinking maybe she could leave her job immediately and never return looks like from the back, that's the answer. Because we had 650 people through the door on that day in response to our call out, and quite a number of people in the room from the National Library's team who thought their day was going to unfold very differently, found themselves interviewing and talking to people about their material. So it was a very collaborative event in terms of the National Library in that sense. Because you can't see my face, we've already seen anguished face, that's how I felt. And I think one of the things that bears out is that this kind of activity is hugely rewarding and interesting, but it's a great deal of work, an enormous amount of work in terms of the engagement with the communities. If you're really in partnership with the people who are coming to speak to you, that's a very in-depth and very significant kind of engagement. And it's a really important piece for engagement across all of the other people who are working with you to make something like this happen. One of the great things that happened then from this experience that we had is that we became engaged with other partners. So another World War I roadshow was held in Trinity College in the following year, in 2014. And because we partnered with Trinity and because RTE were driving it, it took place on a scale and with an ambition that would have been outside what we could even imagine. Subsequently, in 2015, we went on to partner with RTE again on a collecting day around 1916, around memorabilia that people had, private individuals, about the 1916 story, which took place in the GPO. And within that, the National Library's activity was one part of a much bigger event, bringing 100,000 people to O'Connell Street. So that kind of, again, scale and the publicity that comes with a partner like RTE is hugely important in amplifying the message of what you're doing. And I think, just to sum up, at this point, some of the lessons we learned about the collaboration with the public, with our communities. What we can see here is a picture of the Brady family in the GPO. Christopher Brady was one of the men who printed the proclamation in the basement of Liberty Hall. This is his family. They have an original copy of his witness statement to the Bureau of Military History about his experience. And that one of the things that tells us, which is really interesting and which we didn't know taking this on, is that this activity would be intergenerational. That families would come with the member of the family who had perhaps been the custodian of the material, and they would bring sisters, brothers, children, grandchildren, who all of whom were often experiencing the National Library and our partners for the first time. You can see as well this sense that there was a huge appetite, a hugely engaged significance that communities gave to this process of giving something, being invited to do something. Something that was really interesting to us, certainly to me in terms of 1916, is that there was so much material out there that was not known and that was not collected. And that suggests that there's always a lot of material potentially to be collected, depending on your own areas of collecting strength. The thing that we found here in the GPO, and certainly on the first day in the National Library, when those of us who didn't run away did in fact have a great experience, that we were also creating a social space for communities, so that people who had shared or similar experiences were talking to each other. So it wasn't simply about the reciprocal engagement between the library staff and our communities, it was about how the communities were talking to each other about their experiences, their histories, and their stories. And I think what it bears out most strongly is something that Declan McGonigal, former head of the NCAD, talked about recently, about a shift from the rhetorical to the reciprocal. Now, I think libraries have always been quite good about the reciprocal, but maybe we're foregrounding that aspect of our practice a bit more. That we're foregrounding the engagement and the interaction, which has always been part of what we do, ahead of the simply pushing out of information. I think it's also important to say for us at the National Library that this is part of a whole series of processes. So, for example, we have we put some of our photographs on Flickr Commons. So some of our photographs are historic photographs that we don't know a great deal about. We put those on Flickr Commons, and a community comes back to us and tells us a great deal about the information in those photographs. So successful was this process, in fact, that it's now our volunteers who run the entire project for us. So they moderate, they identify the material to be used, and they ensure that the material is fed back to us. Similarly, in what seems like quite a different environment, we've been web archiving since 2011, and we have been doing some selective crawls around particular important events, for example, general elections, referenda, and so on. And that has been a process which has been informed in terms of the selection of material by local libraries, by county librarians, by subject experts. And for 2016, when by the end of the year we will have collected over 400 sites connected with commemoration, in the latter part of the year, we're going to be using this crowdsourcing model again to reach out to the general public and ask them to identify the top 10 websites that represent Ireland in 2016. And And what I'll be very interested to see with these kinds of activities, as well as with the community collecting, is what happens that we didn't expect, that this enables that we don't already know now. For example, the collecting that we did in 2012, where we digitized material, it went onto the Europeana site. In 2015, the British Embassy approached us because they had funding around outreach to do with World War I and the Irish experience. And we had this tranche of material to do with World War I and the Irish experience. And so we could put together a community-based photographic exhibition based on that kind of collection, and one which tied in very neatly to something that another partner wanted to do. And that sense of being able to do more with other people is the other side of all this collaboration, is the partners that we worked with throughout. What's been fascinating about these kind of community collecting days is that I don't think there's any organisation that could actually do them on their own. For example, here is the collecting day in Trinity. So it's using the Trinity premises, their beautiful exam hall. It drew on the regimental organisations. It drew on staff from the National Library. It drew on staff from other organisations. It drew on MPhil and postdoctoral students in Trinity. And that sense of the excitement that comes with working with people who have different strengths and skills is really interesting and very, I think, very developmental for the people who were involved. The other way in which this is interesting, I think, is to be part of a network of development. So Europeana came to us with a model which had been developed in the first instance in the University of Oxford as part of the Great War Archive. They had done some community collecting there and they had built a process around it. Europeana had enhanced that process. They had given us the benefit of their expertise. Part of that expertise was to say we had 100 people in Berlin, you'll never have more than that, so you can't always count on what you're told. But nonetheless, it was made much easier for us because we were working on the basis of someone else's input. And subsequently, people have approached us, asking us to share what we learned. So that's both in terms of actual documentation and in terms of experience. And so Inspiring Ireland, which is a project of the Digital Repository of Ireland, they have been involved in a number of collecting days, again around 1916, in Ireland, but also in London and in New York. And what's been interesting to see for me particularly is how they've enhanced what we did and how you've looked at things that they've evolved and said, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. And because of the nature of the process, there's only benefit to be gained by someone improving on what you've done. And I think, thinking in the end about the importance of this collaborative activity, I think something that's really significant in it, because of the different people who worked together, is that a collecting day is a production event. There's no moving your deadline when you've invited 200 people to come in and share their memories and their stories with you. And there is something about the nature of that kind of production event, like live theatre, that brings groups together. If it doesn't work, it's a disaster. When it does work, it forges bonds in the crucible of a highly intense event. And that's bonds that are formed between the actors, between our digitisation staff, our cataloguers, our interviewers, the people from RTE who are interviewing for their oral history, between the space, between the contributors who are coming with their material. And I think perhaps what's significant is that working with other people is always a delicate balancing activity. I think you can see at least one face there who's thinking, I don't know if this is going to work out. But that when it does, it creates something so significant that the effort is worth it. And I think in terms of the overall story, in terms of trying to knit together the story of Ireland and of Irishness, it's like a jigsaw. The pieces don't make sense until you put them all together. And that's the nature of collaboration. Thank you.